Good evening, everyone. It is with great pleasure that I welcome you to our very first online safety seminar. Thank you everyone for registering. We are over 600 participants this evening, and this just before I started talking. More seem to be rolling in as I'm talking. Tonight's portion of the seminar was developed by Transport Canada in a collaboration with COPA. It's been 3 years in the making, and we are so very proud to be presenting the pilot of this joint venture. JC Audet, our VP of Operations, along with Simon Garrett, General Flight Standards Inspector with Transport Canada, will be presenting part 1 this evening, takeoffs and departures. There will be a 5-minute break between the two presenters. Let me quickly go over the protocols before I hand it over to JC. So in order for us to know that you are participating in the seminar, we need to have your full name. Your camera and your microphone should both be off in order to avoid distraction to our presenters. And if you have a question, please do not unmute. Click the chat button at the bottom of your screen, and then a window is going to appear on the right-hand side where you can ask your question. The question will go to Lauren, and Lauren will compile the question, and at the end of the session we will have some time to answer some of those questions. Unfortunately, we probably won't have time to get to all of the questions, but we will try to answer the ones that come up more frequently. So I hope you find this seminar valuable, and without further ado, I'm going to pass along the controls to JC.
Good evening, everybody, all participants to this first General Aviation Safety Seminar. I'll skip the introduction pretty quickly because Christine did a pretty good job of introducing myself and the seminar and my co-presenter. And the topics of discussion tonight will be first an introduction and update to the General Aviation Safety Campaign. Then we'll proceed through the takeoff and departure module. We'll explain what it is and what it covers. Then we will have a case study. This is when Simon's going to take over. And we'll finish with safety information and handouts. Obviously, it won't be handouts physically tonight, but we call them handouts because they refer to physical materials that Transport Canada has available, and we'll show you how to get it. What is the General Aviation Safety Campaign? A 3-year campaign that was launched in June 17, reflecting or based on an accident that happened in 2012 with a small aircraft. There were 2 fatalities. This launched a safety campaign to improve safety for the general aviation community. As of June 20, the GASC has become a program, or GASP, General Aviation Safety Program. This does not change any of the premises and partnership that initially formed the basis of the GASC. General aviation is defined as all recreational aircraft, including helicopters, gliders, ultralights, amateur-built, and flight training aircraft under CAR 406. Aircraft flown under CAR 604, general operating and flight rules for private operators, are not included. You'll note on the slide that we talk about voluntary, non-regulatory approach. This is not about new regulation. TC isn't coming down with a heavy hand. It's about making the general aviation community more aware that there are ways to be safer and that safety benefits everyone. This campaign was launched in partnership with COPA, who has been instrumental in reaching the general aviation community. Should you be looking to get involved, and we hope so, check out our other seminars happening in your region over the year, because we're starting this and be more and more. Ask us about the General Aviation Safety Working Group, General Aviation Safety Campaign, working groups, and how you can get involved. You can see the email there, but we can provide it to you later also. Now, on with the module itself. Phases of flights. 3 modules have been developed for each phase of flight. This is module 1. and it addresses takeoff and departure. The General Aviation Safety Seminar team has put together a package of 3 modules focusing on loss of control in flight, or LOCI as we call it. We'll discuss that a little bit later. And these modules are intended to be used by the TC regions, by COPA, or any other association interested in providing seminars for the 24-month recurrency program. So anybody in your groups, it's available. So these 3 modules, takeoff and departure, which we'll cover tonight, en route, and approach and landing. So takeoff and departure. We will discuss the takeoff and departure phase of a flight in the context of the GASC. I mentioned about what GASC is, the campaign launched with COPA and TC. The GASC, along with its US counterpart, the General Aviation Joint Steering Committee, has leaned on recent statistics and found that loss of control in flight, or LOCI, LOCI in ICAO taxonomy, has the largest amount of fatalities in the GA community. Although statistics show that there are more LOCI accidents in the approach and landing phase, LOCI accidents on takeoff and departure have a higher number of fatalities. We will not only define what LOCI is, we will also review some facts, discuss the common causes of LOCI, and outline some of the ways to recognize when a potential LOCI scenario is developing, all in an effort to mitigate future LOCI accidents from occurring. We will then take a look at the TSB report, which outlines a typical LOCI accident that occurred in June 2018. Based on our discussions, we will review what the pilot could have done to avoid this accident, keeping in mind that it is totally different when we are armchair quarterbacking versus being actually in the situation. I trust that once we go through this module and review the TSB report, it will bring more awareness to LOCI and how you can avoid putting yourself in a similar situation. Our purpose is to help avoid this. Now, what are some important items that one should check prior to every flight? Obviously, we're not in a classroom. It's difficult to raise your hand and have a discussion. I would ask, though, that we have a couple of slides like this when I ask a question, that you just jot down a few words for an answer. And as we go through, you will see for yourself if you had the right answer, if you got to the same place as we're going. So basically, we know that most GA pilots know the big ticket items that need to be checked before flight: weather, aircraft, weight and balance, fuel, NOTAMs, pilot. Is the pilot all right? But as we move forward with this module, we will be touching on some other items that may not be afforded the attention they deserve. Hence, the reason we're having a number of accidents on takeoff and departure. These particular items are primarily aircraft performance, wind consideration, and runway conditions. So in the flight plan, as I use the words flight planning in here, I am not referring to defining your flight plan and filing it. Think more what the little cartoon shows, pre-flight planning. What are the actions and the considerations you should have before you phone in your flight plan? Weather, we mentioned, NOTAMs, aircraft, weight and balance, pilot. As we discuss these, we will come up with a few specific details. In this case, NAV Canada, ASAP, and NOTAMs for the first item of our list. NAV Canada has done an excellent job of developing and providing a multitude of weather products, and all of us are very familiar with METARs, TAFs, and GFAs, at least if we fly IFR. And most people should be aware of those. They could be lifesavers. So NAV Canada, in this work, has a website, aviation weather website, or AWWS, where you can find anything you can possibly imagine about weather conditions in the area that you intend on flying. How do you find it? Very simple. I'm not giving you a link tonight. All you have to do is Google those four letters, AWWS. It takes you, it shows up some links. The first one that shows up typically is the right one. Click on it, and you get to the NAV Canada weather page for flight planning. Very simple, very easy, and lots of good information, lots of details. Now, ASAP. I'm willing to bet that very few of us, myself included, had not heard of ASAP. Okay, and now I know about it a little bit back, but how many of you do? ASAP stands for Automated Supplementary En Route Weather Prediction. As its name indicates, it is an excellent source of cross-country weather for cross-country flights, and it provides a complete flight profile from start to finish of any flight that you care to inquire about, or any chosen point en route. What kind of information is available there? Well, okay, first, how do you get to it? Well, guess what? That web page, AWWS, that you just discovered, when you're on that page, it looks like a matrix of little blue squares or rectangles with a word, an acronym in each one of them. Well, in the upper right-hand corner, that little box has the acronym ASAP. You click on that one, and it opens a page where you have the opportunity to enter your departing point, your destination, points in between, a whole bunch of questions that you can answer, and the system will give you a whole list of information. Where can you expect clear air and mechanical turbulence, for instance? Where will you encounter headwinds or tailwinds? What is the mean sea level pressure at whatever point you want? What is the temperature and the moisture content of the air? Can you expect icing? Where? And a variety of other information that comes to that. So definitely, we recommend that on your next cross-country trip, do check those two. Even if it's clear, sunshine, blue sky, check them and see what happens, see what you find. And finally, NOTAMs. Well, NOTAMs are also on the same page. On that same page at the bottom, you click for NOTAMs, and then you can select what you want, and they're all there. So very, very useful tool. And it's all free. Now, the next point that we talked about, that we said we would discuss, is the aircraft. What about the aircraft? Well, documents. Important to have a look at that, make sure that we're legal, that we have what we need. The journey log. And a bit of exercise before we go flying, the walk around. So checking your documents is very important to ensure that everything is on board and that everything is current. I'll get back to that one on the next slide. Checking the journey log is very important to ensure that your airplane is serviceable. Is it due for an inspection? Will you be able to complete, if you're going on a cross country, will you be able to come back before the inspection is due? Or is there arrangements for that? And a variety of other things like that. Any snags in the airplane, any deferred defects or things like that. That could be all right, but you got to know about it. The safest thing is to know about all these. The walk around. Well, there are people to do a walk around, which is very thorough, very lengthy. And other people, well, they sort of do it as they walk to the airplane because they've been doing it so often, never found anything wrong. They're very familiar with the airplane and they know who flew it last. It might have been them or somebody else. Doesn't matter. The walk around is your last safety net prior to departure. This is your last opportunity to find out that something is wrong, that a line vehicle came around and accidentally nipped the end of your elevator and it was not mentioned. Or you haven't flown for a few days and some birds or other animals decided to nest, or kind of information like this. There was lots of heavy rain in the last few days. and unbeknownst to you, one of your fuel tank caps is leaking. Should check for water, obviously, or maybe you have all the fuel that you thought you had. Somebody's going around and siphoning fuel at your airport, and you don't necessarily know about it. So, good walk around can save lives, definitely. Okay, I said I'd talk about documents. This is a question that I get on and off, but a bit too often in this in our world. What documents should I have on board the airplane? Well, somebody, it's not me, has come up with an acronym: AROWJIP, AROWJIP. Okay. A stands for airworthiness, your certificate of airworthiness. Do you have one? And do you have the paper on board with you? And is it valid? What does it mean, is it valid? Well, your certificate of airworthiness is there and it's valid if proper maintenance and the condition of the airplane and everything else is there. If the weight and balance is on board, if the journey log is on board, if the operating handbook is on board, and all that kind of stuff, that's what validates your COV. Otherwise, it's just a piece of paper that is not worth much. Next, R for registration. Of course, you need the C of R. Next, the operating handbook. Okay, I've just used those words. There's different words depending on the manufacturer, but we know we're all talking the same thing here. The operating handbook should be on board must be on board the airplane. I'll just correct myself. The weight and balance. Okay, we'll come back to it a little bit later, but just a couple of words. A weight and balance that must be on board the airplane is the weight and balance which is done at your annual inspection. When the annual is done, your AME or DAME verifies the weight and balance or makes a new one if some things have changed. That one gives you the basic flight envelope of weight and balance. And it must be on board the airplane with the other papers. When you go flying and you make your own weight and balance, you start from that one. But that one must be on board, and if you do a new one, it should be with you. Journey log, well, we mentioned a little bit a few minutes ago. Proof of insurance. The law requires that you have insurance on that airplane, at least third party. And then personal documents, your pilot license, your medical certificate, ratings that you may have for the airplane that you plan on flying and the kind of flight you plan on doing. Basically, these three are included in your aviation document booklet. These last three of personal documents I'm talking about. I said I would come back to weight and balance. What's important with the weight? That you fly at maximum takeoff weight or less, that you do not exceed that. Now, in balance, well, that the weight is centered within the moment and CFG envelope of the airplane for safe flight, as per the design and certification. Now, the weight and balance, do you have, by law, to do one for every flight? No, you don't. The one that must be on board and must be done by law is the one I just mentioned on the previous slide. Now, we're talking about you're going flying. Do you need to do a weight and balance again? Well, it depends. If you fly the same airplane with the same partner, the same fuel load, and same thing all the time, you've done it a few times, you know you're well within the weight and balance envelope, and you still do the same thing, obviously no need to do the calculation again, because you'll still get back to the same thing. However, if today you take a couple new friends, okay, or you have more luggage, or things have changed from your regular flights, it is a good idea, and the pilot in command is responsible to make sure that the weight and balance is done, reflecting the new condition. If there's any doubt that the new conditions might put the airplane out of weight and balance. A good question to consider. If you're talking, let's say 172 with two standard males and full tanks, are you within the CFG limits? Well, maybe you are, maybe you're not. Check it. Okay. What about the Cherokee 140? I just mentioned two standard males, two men. The weight that Transport Canada says is the standard weight for two males. Well, not so long ago, 2 or 3 years ago, if I recall, Transport Canada changed the standard weight. They upped it by a few pounds because I guess we tend to get heavier rather than lighter. To do a CFG, or weight and balance, with standard weights is taking quite a risk. If you're flying a bigger airplane, powerful and so on, that you have an error of 20 to 30 pounds on your four passengers, may not be so critical. But if you're flying a 172 with four people and you use standard males and they're a bit over standard, there's a good risk that you might be out of CRG limits. So check it out. Make sure it's your life, it's their life. Okay, when we talk about the pilot now, there's two tools that come in handy. One is called I'm Safe, which most general aviation pilots do know about. And the other one is called PAVE. And this one has come out of the FAA's workshops and that kind of things. I'm Safe, just discuss it very quickly. The I stands for illness. What is your health conditions today before this flight? Do you have any symptoms of any illness? Just do an honest self-assessment, because whatever you feel on the ground at 5,000 feet might feel very, very different and might incapacitate you. So you have to be honest in your self-assessment of health illness. Medications. Are you taking any medication? Which ones? When you were prescribed that, did you inquire what it would do to you? If the label says that it's not advised to drive while you're taking this medication, well, it probably isn't advised to fly either. Is it prescription drugs or over-the-counter drugs? Are you aging? With age, we tend to have more needs for medication. Are they over-the-counter or not? How do they affect us? Cannabis now is definitely recognized as a medical aid. But what about taking cannabis and flying? The law now, since cannabis has come out and been recognized, if you consume cannabis, whatever the reason, and especially medication here as we're talking about, you have to wait 28 days before you fly. Stress. Well, are you under severe stress from work or from home? Do you have a sick child? Do you have family problems? Do you have health problems in the family? Do you have money problems? All of these generate stress. And a lot of us don't really are willing to recognize the stress and what it does to us and the sources. Oops, sorry. Alcohol. Did you have anything to drink in the last 12 hours? Remember the old rule when it was 8 hours from bottle to throttle? Well, it has moved to 12 hours. And it is actually recommended very strongly that you consider 24 to 48 hours. Do I have a hangover? Well, maybe I don't really remember how many hours it was since I had my last sip. But if I have a hangover, regardless of the time, maybe it's a good idea to stay on the ground for today. Fatigue. How much time since your last flight? Like, I'm not talking about several days, but you landed and 10 minutes later you take off again and that's your fourth flight of the day, okay? Did I sleep well last night? Am I adequately rested? Do I have, again, stress can influence that and so on. Be honest in your assessment. Eating, or could be emotions there also. But from the perspective of eating, did you eat enough today before the flight? Did you have proper food that will keep you nourished for the entire flight? You know, we always, I'm ex-military, we always joked about the fighter pilot breakfast. It applies to the charter pilot breakfast, coffee and muffin or coffee and donut. Well, yeah, but that doesn't last very long, and it creates problem in flight. So have good meals, and breakfast is particularly important, more so in aviation than maybe any other place that you could think of. Talking PAVE. PAVE is a personal minimums checklist for risk management, and each letter stands for a different risk factor. P stands for pilot, A for aircraft, V for environment. The V was picked in order to make a word, obviously, and E for external pressure. PAVE is a tool that helps identify risk factors. It helps the pilot to control and manage risk. It helps the pilot to establish a personal minimum checklist, and this is purely self assessment. What are the possible risks that this tool can help you assess? Well, runway length, surface, slope, obstacle. How long is the runway for the flight that you have to do today? Maybe the runway is long enough if you go low fuel and single pilot. But if you go four and full tank, maybe the runway is not long enough anymore. What's the surface condition? Gravel, pave, grass? Have obstacles in your path? What's the orientation? Are you taking off early morning, due east, with the rising sun in your face, blinding you? Okay? All things to think about. Grass runway, what's it going to do to your ground roll? Now, you can find runway data if you look in the CFS, Canadian Flight Sub. There's some information there, but not necessarily all that you might need. Wind conditions. How strong is the wind? Is it a crosswind? What's the crosswind component? Is it a headwind? Is it a tailwind? And any wind will be rarely down the center line, so it will always have a headwind and a side component. Depending where it is, maybe a tail component. As a pilot, are you proficient in crosswind and gusting conditions? How much longer will your ground roll be if you accept a tailwind of 5 knots only? Not big, just 5 knots. We'll see the impact of that later. Density altitude. What is the density altitude today? Who calculated it? Was it calculated? Do we know what it is? Does anybody in the flying club know what it is? How much longer is the ground roll if the density altitude is only 500 feet higher than the field elevation? You could be surprised if you calculate it. So, based on all of that, what we just discussed, what will your aircraft performance be? Will it take off at the expected ground roll? Will you have safety margin? Will you be able to clear an obstacle? Will you be able to do something if you have an emergency? Like airlines say, in the unlikely event of an engine failure or something like that on takeoff or departure, in our case here, do we have options? What are they? Do we have enough runway remaining in front of us to just pull everything back and put the airplane down? Or can we clear the area outside the airport environment for a place to land? Is there something? Do we know what actions we're going to take? Are we proficient in them? When did we last review or practice a forced approach or a simulated engine failure on takeoff? Just the instructor says, I'm pulling the engine, where do you go? Okay, so think of all those. Obviously, there's a lot to be discussed, and we don't have the luxury of discussing all this tonight, but I'm bringing up the points to improve awareness of these issues. This is a portion of an airport out of CFS where it gives you some information about runway data, like distance, length and type, length of runway, type of surface, a slope if there's any, and sometimes advisory. Excuse me. So basically, all that stuff you find in the CFS. But there are sometimes notes that could be important, like birds, wildlife activity, obstacles, possibility of turbulence, and all things like that are not required to be in the CFS, and they're not required to be reported by legally to be reported by the airdrame managers. So some of them will report that kind of stuff, and in a time might be published. Some of them will just put a note on the bulletin board, and some of them say, "Oh yeah, well, everybody who flies here knows about it, so no big deal." So check into that. Crosswind, headwind, tailwind. How good are you with your crosswind? How much can you take? Well, okay, where can you find the crosswind component chart? Because you're not given the crosswind component when somebody gives you the wind. You have to figure out what's your crosswind. In the CFS, there's a chart where you can calculate the crosswind. What you could do maybe is when you get one, cut out that page and glue it in one of the documents you have with you, because that thing never changes. It's just pure geometry. It doesn't change. The GPS doesn't affect it. The temperature, nothing affects it. So when you get one, photocopy it or get one out of your manual and keep it with you all the time. You might not have the manual when you need it. When a METAR or weather report shows a wind, with a gusting wind, what figure do you use to calculate the crosswind component that you're going to deal with? And how much more speed should you apply to your liftoff speed? Well, we can't discuss, so I'll go right away to the answer. Which figure should we use to calculate the crosswind component? We use the highest figure. Let's say, for instance, the wind is 12, gusting 20. Okay. Well, to calculate the crosswind, we should use the 20. How much more speed should we add to the lift-off speed? Half the gust factor. So I said 12 gusting 20. The gust factor is 8. So I should add 4 to my lift-off speed. So if I have a lift-off speed of 60 knots, in this case, I should I should go for a 64 lift-off speed. Flaps in a crosswind. Are you going to use them? Well, some aircraft require flaps for takeoff. So they should be used in a crosswind also. It will affect the behavior of the airplane. Or check the POH. See what the manufacturer says. The manufacturer will either tell you, don't use as much flap, don't use any, use the standard setting, but think of this, think of that, this is how it'll affect, and so on. So you have to be careful on those areas also, of course. On this next slide, we're going to look at what impacts the takeoff performance. Okay, we're going to be talking on this particular chart, zero flap takeoff. What will be the ground roll? Okay, and all these charts we will be talking about a paved, level, dry runway, full power before brake release. So in this case, and all cases that we're going to discuss here, the departure airport has a pressure altitude of 1,500 feet, upper left corner of the chart. Departure airport, temperature 27 degrees C. Weight of the aircraft, 2,316 pounds. Wind, 15 knots headwind. Ground roll, we expect 1150. Lift-off speed, we expect 50. So, okay, how do we look at this chart and how can it help us? Well, first, let's look at the green line. The green line is an ISA day. We all know what an ISA day is. Sea level, 15 degrees Celsius. So the green line, the vertical portion on the left, starts at 15 degrees, moves up to the sea level line. Those 45 degrees curves are pressure altitude lines. So we're 15 degrees at sea level. The green line moves horizontally across to the reference line for the weight of the airplane. This airplane has a maximum weight of 2440 pounds. Then we follow down the more or less 45-degree curves that slant to the right. follow that one until we meet the weight of the aircraft, where it happens to intersect the red line at 2,316 pounds. Then we move straight across horizontally to the zero wind line, and then follow those slanted lines down to the 15 knot wind. And at that point, we read what? 750 pounds. Correction, 750 feet of ground roll on an ISO day. Now we take the same airplane, put it at the same airport, but have a different condition as listed above. Pressure altitude is 1,500 feet. Airport temperature is 27 degrees. So the vertical red line starts at 27, moves up to 15. We move across horizontally, down 45 degrees until our weight, 2316. Then we move clear across and follow down to 1,150 feet at 15 knots headwind. So basically, same conditions of everything, but standard ICAO day, 750 feet ground roll. Our actual day, 1,150 feet ground roll. There hasn't been much of a difference in altitudes, really, and temperature, but it makes a big difference on the ground roll. Now, the blue line shows what happens should you accept a tailwind. Say just a 5 knot tailwind. You follow the red line to the 0 knot wind and then move up on the tailwind lines until you get 5. Then clear across to the edge of the graph, which reads 1,850 feet. Now, 0 flaps, all the circumstances from an ISO day, 750 feet, to a 5 knot tailwind, 1,850 feet ground rolled. That is a tremendous impact. It's more than double. That which should give us enough to think twice before we take off without having a look at actual performance and conditions, and especially with a tailwind. Obstacles. We do hear of those at times. Look at those. What do you see there? Power lines. How far are they from the runway? Are they across the end of the runway or close but parallel to the runway? Will they get in your way if you have to move on that side for some reason? The next one is on the right, upper right, is seems to be a very long runway, but it gives me the impression of being gravel and not quite smooth. So then there's a construction equipment. Well, it wasn't there yesterday, but it's there this morning. How high is it? The other one, beautiful green grass in the forest. But how much space do you have? What do you have as contingency if you got an issue, if you have a problem? So, and one thing to remember, when we're talking obstacle, aircraft are certified with performance charts that give you ground clearance, obstacle clearance on takeoff. And to standardize things for certification purposes, we're talking a 50-foot obstacle. So this is meant to clear a 50-foot obstacle at the end of the runway. So this is how you have to look at this if you want to ensure good outcome on your flying. Okay, here we're going to look at takeoff over the 50-foot barrier, clear a 50-foot obstacle. I won't go through the complete thing because it's the same airplane, same airport, nothing at all has changed. We'll just go to immediately to the right and look at the numbers. The green number, again, is on an ISO day, where we had 750 ground roll. Clearing a 50-foot obstacle requires 1,400 feet. Where we had 1,150 ground roll at our current day, now we're at 2,100 feet to clear the 50-foot obstacle. And where we had 1,750 feet, the blue line with a 5 knot tailwind, now we're at 3,050 feet. So To get off the runway, numbers were not that bad, really. But now we have to clear an obstacle at the end of the runway. Well, things have changed, I would say, quite dramatically. So now let's look at flaps. What happens if I use flaps? Now, some aircraft do require the use of flaps for normal takeoff. And just about most aircraft require flaps for short takeoff and soft field takeoff. So why is that? Why is it that some do not and some do? Well, it's a question of aerodynamics and performance, and the manufacturer could answer the question as to why. Uh, this is too much of a discussion to get into it, but you should inquire about it and you should try to find out why. Ask your instructor. Ask. Internet is great to find information to all kinds of things. What effects do flaps have on performance? We know that flaps will help you get off the ground a little bit quicker. One thing I would say here, as long as you're into ground effect, flaps help you keeping there. And if you're careful, you can climb out of ground effect with flaps extended. So they help your initial climb, you get off the ground and initial climb. But pretty quickly, they also create drag and they don't help your climb performance. So they should be retracted. At what point should they be retracted? Once you know that you are far enough above the ground, above the runway, and that you have enough speed that retracting those flaps will not get you below your stall speed, because that's not what you want, obviously. So basically, you retract flaps in stages if you have the possibility of doing that. Some airplanes are just definite positions that it's all or nothing, like it's specific spread, or others you can go gradually. So know your airplane, know what you can do, and use it to the best advantage. Now, the use of flaps will also impact the performance on takeoff. If we look at this same chart again, same airplane, same airport, boring, isn't it? All the same thing. Basically, excuse me, with 25 degrees of flaps, as per the Piper manual, on a nice day, from 750, you've gone down to 650 feet. On your typical day today, you've gone from 1150 to 975 feet. And with a 5 knot tailwind, you've gone from 1750 to 1600 feet. So using the flaps, as the manufacturer recommends in the aircraft manual, does improve your takeoff roll, your ground roll on takeoff. So look at that also, understand it. And by the way, all that is predicated on the airplane, on the combination airplane and pilot doing exactly the perfect thing at the right moment. Remember that those numbers have been achieved on new airplanes at the factory with highly experienced test pilots on that airplane. So personally, I don't want to insult you, but I'm very doubtful that anyone listening to this, including myself, will match those numbers anytime soon. So be careful, think of it. What could be the factors influencing takeoff? Well, we've discussed a whole lot of things, and we will mention a few more after this slide. But there's one thing. Those factors, those charts, and everything we discussed, yes, we can find them in the pilot handbook for the airplane. But what if you fly a much older airplane that does not have those charts? It has a little book that says a few things, but not much of a chart. You're pretty much on your own to figure out what's happening. What if the airplane is even older and does not have a book at all? What do you do? How do you go about this? How do you find the information that you want? Well, here's something that can help you a little bit. This is a slide that we extracted that comes from the website, Experimental Aircraft. And they provide this to anybody who wants it as a rule of thumb. If you don't have the information available from the airplane manual or such, you can use this to figure out what's happening. So I'll just look at one or two. If you have a 10% increase in weight from your regular flying, you're just adding 20% takeoff distance. If your runway is 1,000 feet higher than usual, 10%. If you got down somewhere down there, if you have a 2% uphill slope, 10% increase. And for us, soft ground and snow is something that we do know about. At least 25%. Of course, we're not talking a meter of snow, like 3 or 4 inches will do it. Okay. So anyway, what you can do, this chart is available to you. Just Google the experimental aircraft.info and you can extract it and you can find a lot of information around that particular chart. Now, factors influencing the takeoff, things that we should consider. Tire pressure. Well, if the one tire or all of them are too low, what will happen? Think of your car. If the tires are too low, you can feel it. It doesn't ride as well. Well, the airplane in flight will not mind, but it has to get there. So tire pressure is important. Wing cleanliness. Let's go directly to the airplane that hasn't been washed for a few years. And it really, people, hey, that's really grungy and things like that. It flies, yes. But I guarantee you that you take the time to wash it with good hot water and good cleaning soap, things like that. Give it a weekend of tender loving care, maybe polish it up and things like that. It will fly better. It may not gain 50 knots on a 150, no, but it can improve it that you will see the difference. So cleanliness affects the airplane performance. Proficiency. How current are you at obtaining the numbers that are listed in the POH or on the charts, like I just mentioned, and particularly for short field or short field takeoff? If you're not proficient enough in that and you have to do some of those, and I suggest that you don't wait until then, get an instructor or get a friend who does it a lot and can coach you. Preferably an instructor is probably the best thing, but practice that. Use it. It might save your day one of those days. Contingencies. Well, what is contingency? What are they? Basically, it's a what if question. Okay? And after we've discussed all those aspects that we just covered in the last little while, almost an hour now, my God, 45 minutes plus. After we've discussed all of these, if we understand them better, how to do things, what we should be aware of, and bear in mind, I stress the word aware. The purpose tonight is to make you aware of things you should consider and think about. It's not flight instruction on those issues. Okay? So get the appropriate guidance or instruction where you feel is required. So what is contingency? Well, what I just said is contingency for one thing, but on a particular takeoff, after you've done all of that, what's an example of contingency? Well, I just mentioned that I absolutely doubt that anybody listening to me will match the numbers that the manufacturer says that are in the book. So you're going to take a little bit longer on the ground roll, a little bit longer to clear the obstacle and so on. Contingency, like a bunch of old pilots have always said, add 10% for the wife and the kids, or other reasons. But you figured all of this? Well, okay, add a bit more to what you really need, or maybe reduce the load. You might be wise to leave a passenger out, or less luggage, or this kind of thing. So consider these. What is the procedure for takeoff being executed, and what should happen? And what emergencies could occur, and how will I handle it? 2 questions that you should ask yourself. Actually, there's more than that, but we'll discuss these 2. We've reviewed all of that. We've added contingencies. We considered it, and so on. Now, you're about to take off. Before pushing the throttle in and releasing the brakes, There's a couple of questions you should consider. You should ask yourself, what is the procedure for the type of takeoff I'm about to do? You should ask the question before you're on the runway, by the way. Before you get on the runway, last thing to save your limbs, what is what kind of takeoff am I doing? Is it just a straight, normal, hard paved runway? I've got a 172 and I've got a 10,000-foot runway, 250 feet wide. Well, standard takeoff is probably good, and I have 10,000 feet to cut my power, to cut the throttle and land if I have an engine uh, failure. But if you're on a short grass runway, think about it. Decide, am I doing a short field takeoff? Am I doing a soft field takeoff? Whichever it is, the, what I will do is this, 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 and this. Review the procedure, and really that procedure is only 3 or 4 steps. Okay, brakes on, hold the brakes, full power. Do I get the RPM I need? Mixture rich, throttle fine if I have a variable pitch. Release the brakes. Is it accelerating the way I expect? Is the airspeed showing up? Okay, I have rotation speed. Ease back under control. Does the nose wheel react the way I want it? Does it come off the ground where I expect it to? Am I going to go flying or not? So you should review that mental checklist that I just went through. This is what I'm going to look for in the next 15 seconds after the controller tells me clear for takeoff, or after I decide that I'm good to go. Now, before I get on this runway, if it's a towered airport, there's a controller who authorizes me on the runway. Should be fine. I say should because we could talk some cases. If it's a non-controlled airport where everybody flies, either report their intention, radio their intention and their position, what they're doing, and there are no other aircraft, it is highly, highly advisable then you do ensure that you have clear airspace to get on that runway. I learned in my private course, and everybody did, when you're taxiing down, getting there, check the base, check the final before you get on. Well, I say when you're taxiing, not on the runway, of course, if there's a taxiway, but before you get on the runway, make sure you're not getting in front of somebody else. For obvious reasons, I'm sure you understand that. The other question, second question, what emergencies could occur and how will I handle it? Well, the one we're talking about normally in these cases is engine failure on takeoff. Other things, we'll see what we do and what we can do. But engine failure on takeoff is more or less the most common one. So let's have a look at this. Because when talking engine failure on takeoff, if you discuss it with most people, most pilots, they'll always say, well, I know, don't come back to the runway. And if I have 1,000 feet or better, I'm coming back to the runway. Okay, that's fine. Now let's analyze this particular expression or this particular statement. If I've got 1,000 feet, is it AGL or ASL? Okay. Now, if you read 1,000 feet on your altimeter, you may only have 500 feet AGL. Think of that one. Remember it. Okay. Are you taking into account the wind today? What's the wind going to do for you? Okay. Is it strong wind, light wind? What direction is it blowing from? Is it a crosswind component that's quite heavy? Are you going to be turning against that crosswind component? So none of those things are helping you to get back to the runway. What's the first thing, if that happens to you? Let's say you're at 1,000 feet. What's the very first thing you should do? Okay, I can hear it. Push the nose down so I get my best glide speed. That's the only thing that'll save your life before you hit the ground or before you touch the ground. So achieve best glide speed. Now, let's say we're at 1,000 feet, your engine just quit, and you achieve best glide speed. How far are you from the runway? Let's say we took off from 09. How far are we from that runway? Well, it depends on what our headwind was. Okay, so we're going that way. Our engine fails at 1,000 feet, some distance from the runway, but we don't know what it is. We just hope it's sufficient. But so I turn. I do my 180 degree. Well, if you notice, a 180 degree turn is nowhere near lining me up with the runway. As a matter of fact, with most cases, especially if the wind is pushing you, if you turned with the wind, you're quite far from the center line of the runway. So you have to come back to it. Another 90-degree turn towards the center line of the runway. Now you have to do that, maneuvering like this against the wind, maintaining best glide speed, and hoping to make the runway. And now you see the runway is not quite getting where you want it to be. A little bit of panic might be setting in. But anyway, you keep working at it. You have another 90-degree to turn to make that runway. You were at 1,000 feet, maintaining best glide speed, hopefully not too far from the runway, and the wind was not really too much against you, and you're not heavily loaded, and all kinds of things like that. Are you going to make the runway? Think about this. Analyze it before you go flying. When you sit, sometimes sitting in your living room, sitting in a chair waiting for some, just think about that. Am I going to make that runway? Okay, at this point, I think it's time for a 5-minute break. I say 5 minutes because we're going to start back in 5 minutes, but there's always a bit of delay. When we come back, Simon is going to take over and go through the case study that we mentioned earlier.
Before we get started again in the second half with Simon Garrett, I just wanted to mention quickly that both Simon Garrett, who is an inspector at Transport Canada, and with collaboration with JC, was instrumental in the development of this seminar. So you're getting the creme de la creme delivering the seminar this evening. And I will pass along now your attention to Simon Garrett, who will be presenting the case study. Enjoy the second half, everyone.
Thanks, Christine, and good evening, everyone. So prior to the break, JC was focusing on aircraft performance and the factors which affect that performance. So I thought to close out our evening, what we'll do is give you a presentation based on the TSB report, which kind of takes all of that into consideration. And unfortunately, several performance factors kind of converged, and the outcome wasn't as positive as one would like. Here are some of the facts from the TSB report. The accident occurred in Seychelles Aerodrome in BC in July, so it was a nice hot summer day. It was a Piper PA-28-140, and the pilot was on a VFR sightseeing flight with his family. He had actually done 2 flights that day. The first flight was with one pilot, himself, of course, an adult, a teenager, and 1 child. And the other one was, the first flight was with 2 children, and then the second flight was with 1 adult, 1 teenager, and 1 child. And unfortunately, the aircraft collided with trees after the takeoff. The pilot was fatally injured, and the 3 passengers escaped with minor injuries. As I said, it was the second sightseeing flight of the day. And on the first flight, as mentioned, there was 1 adult and 2 children. Second flight, 1 adult, 1 teenager, and 1 child. And the pilot did take a break between the 2 flights, and that was due to the high temperature in the cabin. And any of you who have flown Pipers, the old trick in the Piper in the summer, of course, is to open the door a little bit and let the cool air run in. It does get pretty hot in there. The other thing, too, that we should be aware of is that the pilot took 3/4 of the runway, or nearly 3/4 of the runway, before lifting off. He managed to reach an altitude of 100 feet above the runway elevation, and he did maintain a nose up attitude and slowly decelerated into the trees. The total time that he was airborne was 30 seconds before settling into the trees. These 2 METARs were taken within about an hour of the flight. On the first flight, the temperature was a little lower than the second flight, as 22.5 degrees Celsius. Second flight, it was 23.7. The winds had shifted a little bit, but of interest, there was an observation that the windsock on the east side of the airport actually started to show a tailwind, and it was starting to gust. The density altitude was calculated at about 1,378 feet for the first flight. And then on the second flight, the accident flight, it had increased to 1,507 based on the temperature. The other thing that should be noted is that there was turbulence and downdrafts that were encountered on earlier flights in the day on the approach to runway 11, which is where the ravine is. When you look at the airport itself, the runway 29, is sloped about 1%. And this airport, it's known for its turbulence above the ravine to local pilots, not necessarily to transients unless they've called ahead or they're familiar or somebody's advised them. The runway length is 2,400 feet and it's asphalt. And as mentioned before, the elevation is 300 feet above sea level. There are windsocks on both ends of the runway. Now that we've seen some of the facts, at this point, if we were live, I would ask the question and obtain your responses. However, as we're virtual today, let's just take a few minutes to jot down or think of what some of the contributing factors might have been to this accident. So aircraft performance was definitely a factor today. And we do know that the aircraft was close to or at maximum gross weight. We know that the temperature had increased and the density altitude was 1,500 feet on the second flight compared to the 300 feet that it would have been on a standard day. We know that runway 29 has a 1% uphill slope. And remember, slope is not factored into the performance charts. So this is when we kind of need to refer to the experimental aircraft charts that JC introduced to you earlier. And then if you recall, it indicates that for every 2% of uphill slope, you should add at least 10% distance to your ground roll. So in this case, with the accident flight, that means an additional 5% should have been added to the ground roll, or it would have taken an additional 5% just from that uphill slope on the ground roll. We also know that turbulence and downdrafts were reported, and that will certainly affect the climb performance. And we also know that there was a tailwind, which again, according to the EAA charts that JC introduced earlier, that can increase your takeoff roll by up to 20%, even with a slight increase in tailwind, with a slight tailwind. There was a question about fatigue and as to whether or not this was an issue in this flight. The report doesn't indicate anything vis-a-vis fatigue, but it was a hot day. The pilot had already completed the flight earlier in the day. The pilot also took a break, and it's hard to say. Maybe, maybe not. I mean, just the heat of the day and the length of the day may have contributed to a little fatigue, but again, the report didn't indicate. And also, there was clearly some poor decision-making in several areas, and we're going to discuss that further in a few more slides. Again, as we're not live, just jot down a few things or think of what some of the indicators were that the pilot maybe could have recognized to avoid the accident. Definitely the temperature increase, the ground roll distance required. For sure, we had a density altitude situation, we had a tailwind situation, we had gusty winds. Not sure what the component was for the wind, but it certainly played a factor. We definitely know that the turbulence and downdrafts that were encountered over the ravine was an issue, because there were reports earlier today on the approach to runway 11 when that runway was being used. And also when it comes to speed, on the second flight, there was clearly much more distance taken up to acquire the liftoff speed. And then especially since the first flight of the day. First flight of the day, it took about 1,370 odd feet to get airborne. And then on this accident flight, it was closer to 1,800 feet. So that may be something that could have been recognized as well. So the question is do you really know how much effect weather and or other factors have on the takeoff performance? If you look at this case, it just took several small factors, which on their own were probably quite manageable. However, combined, it severely impacted the outcome of this flight. And just for fun, remove any one or two of these factors and ask yourself, would the outcome have been different? It may have been, it may not have been. But the real takeaway here is that if we're not familiar with our performance charts or the factors that affect the performance, and if we don't take into account all the factors in play on a given day, then we ourselves may end up in the trees as well. So it's very important that all factors are taken into consideration based on the situation of the day, and that we adjust accordingly. It's important to recognize for those people who are flying Piper products, as was the aircraft in the accident, or for those who are transitioning from a Cessna product, that the Piper performance charts require density altitude and not pressure altitude when calculating. So what you'll see is you'll see a graph similar to this one that's on the slide at the beginning of all of the performance charts in the Piper manuals. And it's important that you go in and calculate what your density altitude is so that you can use the performance charts accurately. And in this example, there's close to 1,000-foot difference in altitude. So make sure that that density altitude is calculated before you go into charts. So all you need in order to get the density altitude with these charts is the temperature, which will be found in the METAR, and of course the pressure altitude, which will be based on the altimeter setting of the day. Or if you're so inclined, you can always go out to the airplane and just set your altimeter at 29.92, and you'll get your pressure altitude setting. Most important thing to note, though, is in this case, look at the difference between if you just take a pressure altitude figure versus a density altitude figure. There's about 1,000-foot difference, and that could be a big ouch if you don't calculate it properly. When you look at the accident flight, you could consider that with the ravine and the trees at the end of the runway, we could consider that there is an obstacle there as well. And when we look at this chart, you'll notice that you've got two lines. The solid one is representing 1,950 gross weight, and the dashed one is representing 2,150 pounds gross weight. The first set is standard, and the second set is to clear an obstacle. So now let's just look at the differences. We got the fly-ins with JC here, and we'll see what it equates to. So with the situation in this particular flight, when it comes to the ground roll, you can see that it's about 1,000 feet. But when you take into consideration that we need to clear a 50-foot obstacle at the runway, it becomes 2,100 feet. And in the case of our particular accident aircraft, this difference is part of what ended up being an oopsie. What you have to remember also when it comes to the charts, that the wind and the runway slope are not taken into consideration. So this is again where you need to go back, and the chart that JC introduced earlier from the experimental aircraft folks will be very beneficial to you. So one of the last questions that we're going to ask is, do you know where and when you can expect to encounter turbulence? Or in this case, with our accident flight, the question is, how well do we know our aerology when it comes to that ravine? So let's see how the turbulence and the downdrafts, where they're located and how they develop. Keeping in mind that the accident occurred in the afternoon, so it was still quite warm. And when you look at it, and we'll just get some of our fly-ins here, you'll see that we've got the sun is coming down on the eastern side, and to the west of the ravine is the shade. So the result is that on the shady side, you get the downdraft due to the colder air, and then on the sunny side, we're getting some rising air there. Then, of course, you'll see the blue arrows just come into the picture on the right-hand side of the screen. And of course, this is our tailwind. So now, when you get that wind kind of wafting across from the east to the west, and it mixes with the rising air from the ravine and also with the downdrafts, you can see that we're getting a lot of turbulence in that area, as was reported earlier. And unfortunately, it would appear that our accident aircraft was unable to climb at its normal 600 feet per minute or so, and probably, or not probably, but certainly did enter into some of these downdrafts and wasn't able to climb out of them. And the last question, and again, just think about it for a few minutes, is how could this pilot have mitigated this situation to avoid the accident? Well, I think there's all sorts of mitigations that could have occurred here, but I do see two key ones that may have helped. First of all, were all the factors taken into consideration for the conditions of the day, and was the performance checked prior to departure? So in other words, did the pilot do any sort of takeoff calculations, taking into account all of the conditions of the day? Not sure. Probably not. But if he had done so, maybe the outcome would have been different. And perhaps the one that really would have saved the day is, did the pilot choose a go, no-go decision point? If he did, then he was not committed to it. And this is a topic that's kind of close to my heart because personal experience at the club where I used to work, we had a procedure in place which was very disciplined when it came to pre-takeoff briefing. And by doing that briefing and knowing what our go, no-go decision point was, over the years, we had several successful projected takeoffs. One of them was when a bird flew through the cabin and into the student pilot. And if it wasn't for these, prepared, planned briefings and knowing what our decision point was, it could have ended up a lot worse. Luckily, the instructor took control and was able to bring the airplane to a stop. And when we had the debrief after, it was all down to, you know what, Simon, if we hadn't had that procedure in place about making sure that we chose the go, no-go decision point and what we were going to do in the unlikely event of something happening, then that may have not ended up as well. The other thing too is it's very important because we're noticing that we're getting a lot more runway overrun accidents these days. Well, the reason it's near and dear to my heart is because, as I said, we've had personal experience with it. But the one thing is that, there'll be many times that I'll be sitting at an airport, and it's not just on takeoff, but it's also more so on landing, where you'll watch an aircraft come in, and the aircraft will float down past 1/3, pass down 1/2, and then they land past 1/2, and whoops, they made it. And it's really not the way to go about doing things. If we go back to the takeoff now, it's very important because when we talk about the pre-flight brief and choosing a go, no-go decision point, you're actually setting up yourself with your last line of defense in terms of a safety net should something go wrong. And one of the first indications of something not being right is if you're not getting the expected performance for the airplane, then something is not right. And if we know beforehand, or if we calculate beforehand, based on the conditions of the day, what our go, no-go decision point is and choose it, if we're not up by that go, no-go decision point, then there's definitely something that's not right. And unfortunately, I think too many of us tend to go past the go, no-go decision point if one was chosen, and we're not totally committed to it. And it's all okay, well, we're just a little bit past, it's okay. And then before you know it, you're not just a little bit past, you're a long way past. So all of this to say is that, it's a very good safety net for you in terms of it's another one of those things, or perhaps one of the last things that's going to help you decide whether or not you're getting the performance out of the airplane. And especially think of it when you've got unusual situations in terms of high density altitude. You're going, for example, I know that there were clubs in the past that used to take 6 or 7 airplanes, and they would jaunt down to the States. And some of the airports that they would run into in Arizona and Nevada and places like that, where your density altitude is huge compared to what you've been flying on back home when we're sitting here close to sea level. So that's another good kind of thing to have in your pocket to help you in terms of determining whether or not it's safe to depart, and so on and so forth. The other part to that, of course, is not just choosing a go, no-go decision point, but it's also, do you have in your mind what you're going to do should something go wrong in the event of an engine failure on takeoff or a critical emergency? As JC said before, the engine failure on takeoff is the most common thing that we worry about. And even though there's talk about the 180-degree turn, clearly, and we've seen it from many of the accident reports, it's really not the way to go. You really have to be, if you go out and try it at altitude, and keep in mind as to what JC was saying, the conditions of the day really do have an impact. And that 180-degree turn, everything has to be going right for you. You have to be high enough, you have to be quick enough. Remember, there's a startle factor, which delays you probably at least 10 to 12 seconds. And during that 10 to 12 seconds, when you've got the startle factor in effect from the engine failure, you've gone that much further from the airport runway, and you've also gone that much further down in terms of altitude. So if we go back to Basics 101, it's that if we have an engine failure on takeoff, we should be looking either side of us to a splay of about 30 to 45 degrees and make gentle or as gentle as turns as possible to get into an area. Now we know that at some airports that may not be possible. And if it's not possible, then maybe what we can do is think about climbing out at VX rather than VY. Because then you'll get more altitude sooner, and in the event of an engine failure, then you will have an opportunity to maybe make something. And this goes back to, of course, what we should be doing when we go into a new airport or when we're at our own airport. Do we know where the outs are at the end of the runway that we're departing as to where we can go in the event of an engine failure? So these are all good things to consider and put in your top pocket for useful information and help to try and save the day. So that was all ad hoc, folks. So thanks for putting me in that, JC. Back
No
to
problem, Simon. It might have been ad hoc, but it reflects a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge and a lot of understanding of what really leads to accidents.
you.
At this point, maybe being that your professional side is TC, maybe you'd like to address the next 2 or 3 slides talking about available information, documents, and so on that pilots can obtain free from transport.
Yeah. Thanks, JC. Well, the biggest thing is that, speaking to all of you folks when I'm out there in the field, I know there's a number of you that would love to have the paper copy of the ASL back. And I too like that paper copy as well, because that's one thing you can do in certain places in the house that's really relaxing. But that said, we do have it online. And a lot of people may not realize that you can still get the aviation safety letter just by going online. It's free of charge. And if you just go to the Transport Canada website and type in aviation safety letter, or if you go to publications, it's TP 185, you'll see that there's a sign-in for an e-bulletin, and you're able to access and get the ASLs. So we're still putting the ASLs out there. Unfortunately, and especially now, I cannot ever promise you that it will go back to paper. It is what it is, but it is available. So hopefully folks can adjust to that. And if you do want to read it in certain rooms in the house, then maybe just print it out and you can take it with you. The other thing too is that the Aeronautical Information Manual is a very beneficial manual to have at your beck and call, and it is free, and all you need to do is go to this website, and you can maybe just take a picture of it with your phone, and you can download the manual for free. Not that you would want to download the whole thing, but at least you can access any information that you may wish to read up on.
Yeah, Simon, if one Googles TCCA for Transport Canada Civil Aviation Aeronautical Information Manual, it gets you to that publication.
Yeah, okay, thanks, JC. We still have some great posters out there. We've got a lot of new ones, and the link that's shown will take you to the General Aviation Safety Campaign poster gallery. And you'll see that in the last year, we've probably put out about 6 new ones. So for those of you who would like to get these posters, you can go to that link and you can either order them or download them. And if you're having trouble with that, or if you want some hard copies, then by all means let JC know or let me know, and we'll make sure that we get some mailed out to you. The other new kind of calling card, let's call it, that we have out there now because of the General Aviation Safety Campaign is a nice card that's giving you all of the information. and a quick reference guide there. And it gives you our TC General Aviation email. Now that TC General Aviation email actually goes direct to my desk, and it goes direct to my colleague Ludovic, who's online with us today. So thanks, Ludovic, for all of your help with this. And either Ludovic and I will answer any question that you may have that comes through on that email.
Simon, at this point, and we're still doing very well on time. I would ask you to take, I mentioned the GSC moving to a program. I would ask you to just take maybe 2 minutes to explain what this means, that the campaign becomes a program.
Sure. Well, the General Aviation Safety Campaign, which was established in 2017, was strictly a campaign. And with Transport Canada, our protocol is to only run campaigns for 3 to 5 years maximum. We did look at possibly running the campaign for an additional few years, but with the success of the campaign, it was determined that we needed to turn it into or transition into a general aviation safety program. So that happened in June, on June the 1st. And now, as a program, nothing's going to change in terms of our relationship with COPA or our relationship with CASARA or Smart Pilot or NAV Canada or any of those organizations out there. What we are going to be able to do as a program is spend more time with the organizations to develop mitigation strategies through our working groups. And all of the working groups that were developed at the General Aviation Safety Campaign have also transitioned over to the program. So they remain untouched. All that's going to happen is the structural format in terms of the organizational format is going to change slightly. Whereas with the campaign, we had a focus group. We're now going to go to the FAA model, and we'll have a steering committee. And instead of having a safety initiatives team, which JC and I established back about 3 years ago, we're going to change that to a safety analysis team, and its role will be a little bit different. And then under the safety analysis team, we're going to have the working groups. And I'm pleased to say that the working groups are coming along, even with COVID. 3 of them are extremely active. And in one case, we've managed to open 4 sub-working groups to the main working group. So all of this to say is we're not going away. You're going to see as much and hopefully more of us than you have in the past. And also too, perhaps one of the biggest things that's coming out of the transition to a program is what you're seeing tonight. JC and I have been working on this for at least 2 years, trying to get this kind of vision of a national safety seminar program out there so that not only can TC regions, but also COPA, CASARA, Smart Pilot, and other organizations are in a position to deliver these seminars. These seminars are going to be made available to one and all. And also, we're going to allow the some of the members of COPA and other organizations to present these seminars. But the most important thing of this, just one more thing, JC, is that this is all about collaborative effort. So when we deliver these seminars, we want all of the organizations and associations involved. So if you're planning a seminar and you're going to use one of these seminars or one of the Smart Pilot seminars, you know, let's call the local TC region or local office that you're dealing with and say, hey, I want to put on one of those seminars. Can you send a person over, or can we have one of your people come over and do it with us? And, you know, invite that local NAV Canada rep, invite that local TSB rep, you know, get a few people involved so that you can have mini modules, including this one or one like this, so that you can put together a recurrent training program. And how often do you want to do it? As often as you want. And the other thing is, will it always count for 24-month recurrency? Yes, only if you apply to Transport Canada and indicate to them or submit an application to them indicating that you would like it approved for recurrent. There, again, ad hoc.
Okay. There's too much information. We need a seminar just to cover that. But anyway, at this point, I'll say thank you very much for all of that, Simon. We thoroughly enjoyed preparing this and delivering it. And now I'll turn this back to Christine or Lauren.
Hi, JC.
Yeah.
Lauren here. I have been collecting questions from the chat, and there are quite a few questions for you. So I'll feed those to you. The first one comes from Alan, and this is going back to the beginning of the presentation. Do we need AWWS if we are using ForeFlight for our briefings and filings?
Do you need it if you use ForeFlight?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. No, it's if you use personally, I use ForeFlight with an iPad Mini for IFR flying, and I get all the information I want because the information comes for Canadian information. The information comes from NAVCAN. It's nobody else that gives it to. From NAVCAN, from the same source. So if nobody else gives them the information, it's the same source. So whether you get it from internet on AWWS or you get it on ForeFlight, it's the same thing. It's every bit as good.
Okay. The next question comes from David. He asks, are digital copies of documents acceptable, such as your pilot license, medical, etc.?
Well, yeah, it's the same as nowadays. Digital version is the same. But the thing is that you got to have your booklet with you, and those show in the booklet. So you certainly cannot have a digital version of the booklet. The booklet is there for that purpose, that you have it with you, and that contains your medical, your license, your rating, and everything else.
Okay.
That would be my answer to that, unless Simon can tell you I'm wrong.
No, all of the documents that you outlined before need to be the originals. The one thing that I know you can scan or have on your phone or on your EFB is your insurance. As long as you can provide proof of insurance on your EFB or on your phone, that is acceptable. I do know that, but everything else should be the original.
This is another question about documents. So this pilot Jeffrey says that his journey log also doubles as a detailed maintenance log, and this is what he inherited with his aircraft. Maintenance records technically shouldn't be carried on board in case of a fire, but how to deal with this requirement, but also meeting the requirement of having the journey log on board during the flight?
Well, the journey log has to be on board during the flight by law, legal requirement of the cars. The only exception is if the point of departure and landing is the same. You take off and come back to the airport in an hour or so. You don't need to have the logbook on board. For example, the flight school. Students go up, the logbook is not on board. Now, the fact that it may have some maintenance record in there is not the factor, because the airplane in any situation should have some technical records. So even if the logbook were to be lost, technical records exist of exactly what maintenance has been done on the airplane. So
Yeah,
the law is, sorry, Simon, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think Jeffrey is indicating that his journey log has kind of been combined into a maintenance log as well. If that's the case, Jeffrey, what I'm thinking is you should maybe transpose the information or scan your journey log and produce or get yourself set up with some technical logs.
Another couple questions on prepping for the flight. So Tom asks, is doing a weight and balance just using ForeFlight, assuming it's been set up properly, adequate evidence of proper flight planning?
Well, I have used ForeFlight to do weight and balance for every flight that I was doing. For a while, I was flying a Chieftain, and things were changing quite often. So what I did simply was in ForeFlight, I did not set up the weight and balance in ForeFlight. I entered the one that was done on paper at my AMO at the latest annual for that airplane. I entered those parameters in ForeFlight weight and balance app, and from there, all I was doing was adding fuel, passengers, luggage, or whatever, and getting my weight and balance numbers. It was very, very fast. It's perfectly accurate, and it's legal.
Okay, great. Another question about documents. Must you have available proof of 24-month currency on board?
No.
No. But what I will say about that is a lot of people don't realize that the new logbooks, the new personal logbooks, if you go to the back of the logbook, you'll see that the allowance for the 24-month recurrency, they've got a whole page or two that allows you to enter the information so that you meet the requirement. A lot of people don't realize that that's in the logbook. And if it's not in the logbook, just take one of your lines, your next line, and just make an entry indicating that you attended a seminar and put the seminar title, the date, the presenter, and keep it with you. And that would be great.
Perfect. So the next question comes from Brian, who's an ultralight pilot, and he appreciated the chart you showed with the performance for takeoffs, but he says he doesn't have any of the performance charts for his aircraft, and is wondering, do you have any practical suggestions for how to capture the intent of safety related to those charts and documents for ultralights?
Yeah, if I may, I'm going to turn this
Go ahead.
question over to Ludovic, who's online, I hope. And the same way, JC, that you put me on the spot, I'm going to put Ludovic on the spot. So Ludovic is my colleague with the General Aviation Safety Program, and Ludovic is the lead of the Ultralight Working Group. So I'm going to let Ludovic answer that question because he's doing an awful lot of things to do with the ultralight community. And this might be one of those things that we need to do to help you. Maybe we need to get those charts out to you through the best practices. So I'm going to stop now, otherwise Ludovic will have nothing to say. Go ahead, Ludo.
Hello, thank you, Simon. Could you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yes, okay. Yes, so I'm working basically on the ultralight working group, part of the campaign, and we know a lot of ultralight doesn't have charts for this type of performance, and usually we have published since last year a few best practice guidelines to help you. About that, there is no performance chart, but it helps you to see what you should do before flying. There is one on operation, cross-country flying, and one on maintenance, and one should be soon available in the next month, I hope, about test flying and ultralight, because most of you do your own maintenance on it. So it will help you. There is no particular chart, but we try to create a network, so about inside the ultralight community, a broad network, and where you can find maybe some resources through instructors, some people who have the same type of ultralight that you have. And maybe I will refer you maybe either to UPAC associations. I may have some chart or may be able to help you, or the CLSAA too is a new association about light sport aircraft, or mostly advanced ultralight in Canada. So we're developing a lot of things to help you, and we have seminars that we create about transition training when you pass to an ultralight to a different one. Also, that could performance are different, and we try to emphasize the fact that you have to know your aircraft, and the test flight guides that will be released soon can help you to figure out those performance. There will be some guidance about how to find your performance on the first flight you do on your ultralight. So hopefully it could help you to tailor the performance of your aircraft.
Okay, thank you, Ludovic, as well. Simon, while we're talking to you, there's been a few questions specifically about the case study. So in the accident summary, was there a consideration of flight speed? And the writer says there's a tendency to pull back on the stick to make the airplane climb, which sometimes results in worse performance.
Yeah, absolutely. There is a little bit about that. Clearly, the pilot did maintain a nose-up attitude, hoping to get the lift. I think what happened, and I'm no expert, but I think what happened is he probably got into ground effect, but he wasn't able to get out of it. And I think he was probably consciously or subconsciously pulling back on the control column until he just settled into the trees.
Our next question comes from Colin, who will be flying into Ram Falls, Alberta this weekend. He says, if you do have to put the aircraft into the trees, what are some good rules of thumb for doing so?
Do it when there's leaves on the trees.
Simon, who's going to jump? Well, actually, this is not something that I put in it will show in a POH and so on, but I was taught by my flight instructor when I was doing private and then commercial And in the military, this was discussed also, assuming that you fly a small single engine, because we do have some of those also in training. If you're stuck having to go into trees, the one thing that you do not want to do is slow down to the extent that you stall above the trees, because you're going to nose in and you're going to take everything with you, fuel tanks and all of that. So the wise advice from people who had not had to do it, but it does make sense to some extent, is to go in as slow as you can, but not stall, but going flying. Like Simon says, go where there are leaves. Yes, it will cushion. The top of the trees will start slowing down the airplane. And guess what? That engine in front has inertia and is pulling. Okay, there's a mass that's going. Wings are starting to hit trees. Wings will come off. But that engine and the fuselage keep going. And when it gets to the ground, the wings will be gone, the fuel tanks will be gone, the engine will have stopped, risk of fire is very, very minimal, and so on. What will happen to people inside? Well, I don't know. But anybody who has ever discussed this technique, so called, if you want to call it that, has never had to try it. So it's a theory, it's a discussion. From a physics point of view, it does make sense. Does it work? I hope I never have to try it.
Okay, thank you. And we got this question from a few different members. How do you determine a go, no-go point on a runway? Are you looking for landmarks to be off the ground or to have achieved a specific speed?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, okay, go Simon also. Either one. Okay. Go ahead.
You can go first.
Well, what I was going to say is you can look for a marker on the run about the runway. Now, if you're in a small private airport, it's very easy to put a marker, be it a piece of red tape, spray paint, red spray paint that you put every once in a while after the lawn's been cut, something that is unobtrusive, that if you drive over it, it won't hurt anything, but you will see it. And how do you determine it? Well, fly your airplane and know, let's say I'm talking about a nose wheel, a tricycle gear, for instance. Know at what point the nose wheel comes off the ground. And once you know that, go mark it. And then that's your reference for future flights. And pretty quickly, you get to be used to that distance, and you can use it, you can visualize it at other airports. Of course, if you're flying on the Ottawa airport, it's kind of difficult to go put a paint marker on the pave. But there are marks on the runway. There's things on the side, things like that. You have to be creative as to what you use, but don't use something that tends to move, change place. Simon, add.
Yeah. So to add to that, it's knowing your performance figure. For example, you should know off the top of the head what your ground roll is for a normal departure. Like in the Cessna 172 November, it's about 840 feet. Also, we know the landing roll is about 500 feet. So what you can do is you can also work at an accelerate stop distance available. You can take your takeoff ground roll, you can take your landing ground roll, you can add 400 feet for reaction time, and that total will give you an accelerate stop distance available. But more importantly, when it comes to the go, no go decision point, it's all got to be based on the conditions of the day, and you should calculate that prior to going, so that it's true what JC was saying. You get familiar with the distance after a while, especially at your home airport, but you have to be flexible because conditions are always changing. The only constant in flying an airplane is change. And also you're flying into different airports. So what you need to do is scope it out beforehand and choose a landmark, or use the runway lines. You've got 100 feet lines and 100 feet between, or use maybe a windsock that's may be located close to your go, no go decision point. Anything that you can use will be great. And the biggest thing I can say, especially reading the accident reports lately, and I'm sure Kathy will back me up on this, but we're seeing now a lot of runway overruns. So that means two things are happening. People are not committed to their go, no go decision point when it comes to takeoffs. And number two, on landing, people are not committed to a point, at which point, if they're not down safely on the ground, they should be overshooting and going around rather than forcing it down or landing further down the runway.
At this point, Lauren, I think that we have 3 minutes left, so maybe Christine wants to have a closing comment.
Yes. I guess Christine, if you're ready to come back on, I think she just needs 1 minute.
Okay.
What I would like, if we can, Lauren, Christine, JC, is that it's unfortunate that we can't have the interaction that we would normally have in a live situation. And we realize that when we go virtual, especially with this many people, it's really a one-way conversation. But with that said, it's important that all of the questions that are being asked tonight, we answer them. So I am willing, Ludovic and I will, if you pass on any questions which you yourself, JC, cannot answer,
Yeah, I will
pass them on to Ludovic and I, and Ludovic and I and JC now will make sure that we get back to you personally with the answers to your questions. And if we don't know the answers, we'll find the answers for you and make sure they do get answered, okay?
Perfect. Thank you, Simon.
Okay, thank you very much. I was actually going to say that in my closing remarks, but now I can shorten it by less than a minute as well. I just wanted to offer one clarification. ForeFlight combines weather data from the National Weather Service and Environment Canada. So they don't get their weather from NAV Canada, but they do get it from the National Weather Service and Environment Canada. I hope that
You're
all
absolutely
found...
right. I forgot about that one.
It's okay. I hope that you all found part one of the safety seminar valuable and that your takeaways will enable you to make safer decisions. Please don't forget to attend part two this Thursday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and we will be presenting pilot decision making. A link was sent to you this afternoon at the same time as the link for this part in a separate email. I'd like to say a special thank you to Simon Garrett for presenting the case study this evening. And I also wanted to add that in order for this seminar to count as your pilot recurrent training, simply put the title of the seminar, the presenter, and the date of the seminar in your personal logbook. COPA will be keeping a list of all the attendees to both parts of the seminar for 2 years, should TC require to see the list. So thank you again for participating in our very first online safety seminar. And I wish you all a good night, and we'll see you next Thursday.